haven't been here before, this is what you can expect. True scary stories. Tonight we delve into another eerie tale that blurs the line between reality and the unknown. So, dim the lights, settle in, and prepare yourself for a journey into the depths of Japan's most haunting legends. If you love exploring the mysterious and the macabre, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a haunting story. Before we begin, let me ask you this. How brave are you? Will you dare to listen to these stories alone in the dark, or will you turn away when the shadows seem to move and the whispers grow louder? Tonight you'll decide if you believe in the unseen, the unexplained, and the truly terrifying. Title: The Man in the Garden. It was a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind where the streets were lined with rows of identical houses, and the only disturbances came from the occasional lawnmower or the distant hum of a car engine. The sort of place where everything seemed ordinary, until of course you started paying attention to the small details. Little things that seemed out of place, like the knock that came every night, a sound faint enough to be dismissed as the wind or the house settling. But after a while, when the knocks grew more frequent and more insistent, something else started to feel very wrong. The Bennett family had just moved into the house on Maple Street a few months earlier. It was a charming home, with a large garden that wrapped around the back, a little patch of greenery surrounded by a white picket fence. They were excited about their new life in the suburbs, fresh air, peaceful surroundings, and a place to raise their 2 children. But from the moment they arrived, something about the garden felt off. It wasn't the flowers or the neat rows of vegetables that unnerved them. No, it was something much deeper, an invisible presence, one that seemed to stir whenever anyone ventured near the garden's edge. At first they chalked it up to an overactive imagination. After all, it was just an old garden, overgrown perhaps, with a few weeds in places, but nothing sinister about it, or so they thought. It wasn't until the knocking began that they realized something darker might be lurking in the shadows of their idyllic new home. It was the youngest Bennett child, Olivia, who first mentioned it. She was only 6, a bright-eyed girl with a wild imagination who loved to spend her afternoons outside, playing in the garden. One evening, as her parents tucked her into bed, she whispered in a hushed voice, almost as if she didn't want anyone else to hear, "Mom, Dad, there's someone in the garden." At first, her parents smiled at her words, brushing them off as the fantasies of a child who had watched one too many ghost stories. But when the knocking started that very night, they grew less sure of what they were dealing with. It began softly at first, just a light rapping on the bedroom window. They assumed it was a branch from the tree in the yard, tapping against the glass, a harmless occurrence caused by the wind. But the knocking didn't stop. Night after night, it grew louder, more insistent, and the strange part was that, whenever they checked, the window was always empty. No branch, no animal, just an eerie silence. They tried to ignore it, hoping it was just a figment of their imagination, but the sound was undeniable. Knock, knock, knock. The unmistakable tap on the window pane, always at the same time, always when the house was asleep. Something was trying to get their attention, but they couldn't figure out what it was. One night, as the knocking grew louder, the family decided to investigate. Mr. Bennett grabbed a flashlight and went outside, scanning the darkened garden for any signs of life. The beam of light flickered as he swept it across the rows of plants and flower beds, but there was nothing but the quiet rustling of leaves in the wind. He made his way around the garden, his feet crunching the gravel path, but no matter where he looked, there was no sign of anyone. The air felt thick with unease, but he shook it off, blaming the late hour and the creeping paranoia of living in a new place. The next day, things took a turn. Mr. Bennett was reviewing some old family photographs when something caught his eye. There, in the background of an old snapshot of the house from decades ago, was the unmistakable figure of a man, a tall, shadowy figure, hunched over, digging in the garden. His face was hidden in the dark, but there was no mistaking the posture. The figure seemed oddly familiar, even though Mr. Bennett had never seen him before. He quickly turned the page, dismissing it as a strange coincidence. that the image lingered in the back of his mind. That night, the knocking returned. But this time, there was something else. It wasn't just a sound. It felt as though something was standing outside the window, watching them, waiting for them to acknowledge its presence. Mr. Bennett's wife, Sarah, was the first to feel it. A sudden drop in temperature, a chill that swept through the room, despite the warmth of the summer night. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was outside was desperate to get their attention. That night, as the knocks grew louder and the atmosphere grew colder, Mr. Bennett knew they couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to confront whatever was haunting their home. Armed with a sense of growing dread, he grabbed the flashlight again, this time with a sense of finality. He was going to find out what was out there. He ventured out into the garden once more, his feet shuffling on the gravel path as he moved towards the back of the house. The garden looked just as it always had, peaceful, silent, but that underlying feeling of wrongness still lingered. As he approached the edge of the garden, where the fence met the woods, he noticed something strange. Footprints, faint but distinct, leading toward the tree line. They weren't the kind of footprints made by an animal or even a human. They were deep, almost unnatural, as if something heavy had been dragged across the ground. Suddenly, a flash of movement caught his eye. A shadow passed over the garden, but when he turned his head, there was no one there. His pulse quickened as he stepped closer to the edge of the garden, where the footprints led into the shadows of the trees. It was then that he saw it. A figure, a man, dressed in old worn clothing, was standing motionless in the garden, digging into the soil with a rusted spade. His movements were slow and deliberate, as though he were burying something or someone. The Mr. Bennett froze, his heart racing. The figure in the garden was just like the one in the photograph, tall, shadowy, his features hidden by the darkness. He wasn't digging for flowers or plants. He was digging for something far darker, something far older. The air felt thick and oppressive, as though time itself had stood still. Suddenly, the man looked up, his eyes glowing with an unnatural intensity. He didn't speak, but the weight of his gaze seemed to pierce through the darkness. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, and Mr. Bennett felt an icy grip close around his chest. The man's lips curled into an eerie smile, but before Mr. Bennett could move, the figure vanished, sinking into the earth beneath him, as though he had never been there at all. Mr. Bennett stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. What had he just seen? Was it a ghost? A memory of something long buried? The figure had seemed so real, so solid, and yet, when he blinked, it was as if the man had melted into the very soil of the garden itself. The knocking had stopped after that night, but the unsettling feeling in the house remained. Mr. Bennett and Sarah decided it was time to dig into the history of their home and its past, hoping to uncover the truth behind the mysterious figure in the garden. They pored over old records and documents, seeking answers, but what they found only deepened the mystery. According to local historians, the house had once belonged to a man named Edward Whittaker, who had lived there in the early 1900s. Edward was known for his obsession with gardening, particularly the cultivation of rare plants. However, his neighbors spoke of strange happenings in the house, late-night digging in the garden, the unexplained noises, and a growing sense of dread that seemed to linger around the property. Eventually, Edward had disappeared, leaving behind nothing but his garden and a trail of unsettling rumors. As the Bennetts uncovered more details about Edward Whittaker, they realized that the garden was not merely a place for flowers and plants, it was a place of secrets, a place where the dead had been buried, where something had been concealed beneath the soil. Edward's disappearance wasn't an accident. He had been hiding something, and whatever it was, it had never been found. Though the knocking had ceased and the figure had vanished, the Bennetts could never shake the feeling that something was waiting in the garden, something old, something buried, something that refused to remain forgotten. They never spoke of the incident again, but they knew that the garden held a power that could never be fully understood. It was a place where time itself seemed to blur, where the past and present collided in strange, terrifying ways. And as the years passed, the Bennetts learned to live with the garden's secrets, knowing that it would always be a part of their home, watching from the shadows. The garden remains, its secrets buried deep in the soil. And though the knocking has stopped and the figure has vanished, those who venture too close to its edge will still feel its pull, feel the weight of the past pressing down on them. The man in the garden may be gone, but his memory lingers, waiting for the next curious soul to uncover the truth. These are just a few of the countless chilling stories from Japan, each one a window into a past full of unresolved mysteries, lost souls, and forgotten fears. Whether it's the distant wail of a ghost, the sudden chill in the air, or the unexplainable sense of being watched, these experiences leave us with one undeniable truth. We are never truly alone. But which one of these eerie tales left you with chills? If you crave more stories like these, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to be the first to hear about our next haunting tale. Sweet dreams if you dare.